3.6, part 2, the reproduction section. Application, if you want to pause and have a look at it with the menstrual cycle. Now, there is literally no easy way to remember this. There's no kind of tricks or anything that makes this any easier than just learning it and recalling it. So, apologies. Right, here we have a graph that, or numerous graphs that I think just really breaks it down and makes it really easy to see what's going on. So you can see that we've got here, we've got the uterus lining. Now, obviously, here the uterus lining is thick. It's then thin here, gets thicker and thins out again. This section here is showing you the follicle or the egg. This is the egg here. The follicle is what you find inside the ovary, and you've got the egg inside that follicle. So the follicle is the follicle contains the egg. The egg is then released from the follicle. This body temperature section you don't need to worry about. They won't ask you anything about that, so don't panic. This was just a nice graphic. This bit not important for IB. Here you've got the LH, the dark blue line, and your FSH. Here on the light blue line, they are the pituitary hormones. We've also got here progesterone on dark blue and estrogen on light blue. You don't need to call it the estradiol, it's estrogen. They are the ovarian hormones. So you've got your ovarian hormones, you've got your pituitary hormones. Okay, days 1 to 7 or thereabouts of the menstrual cycle is menstruation. It's where a female has the period. So you can see here that this is day 0, the first kind of 7-ish days. It might be 3-4 days for some people, it might be longer than 7 days for some people, but around 7 days. So the menstruation is the shedding of the uterine lining. So you can see that the uterus lining was very thick, and then after menstruation, it's far thinner. You can also see, I've also color coded these, so FSH is in green. So FSH is this light blue line here. So FSH at the beginning of the menstrual cycle increases and causes the follicles to develop. So you've got your follicle here, you can see that the follicles are developing and getting bigger. That's as a result of FSH. FSH, oh, I forgot to make that green, sorry. FSH also causes estrogen levels to increase. So you can see here that your estrogen levels at the beginning of the cycle increase. Now, low levels of estrogen help to thicken up the endometrium. So they help to cause this kind of thickening of the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. High levels of estrogen inhibit the FSH, and that's useful because it means that only one follicle is released every cycle. So you don't want to continue developing and releasing these follicles, you just want one every cycle. So high levels of estrogen inhibit the FSH. So up here, you can see that the FSH starts to decrease when the estrogen levels get high. That's an example of positive feedback. And the FSH also stimulates the LH. So you can see that the FSH increasing then causes this peak of LH. Now, the peak of LH causes ovulation to occur. So you can see that the LH peak and ovulation are happening at the same time. Now, ovulation is actually the release of this egg from the follicle. So this wasn't ovulation down here. This is ovulation about day 14 in the middle of the cycle. Now, after ovulation has occurred, the egg obviously has left the follicle. The remainder of the follicle becomes this here, which is the corpus luteum. So this structure here is the corpus luteum. Now, the job of the corpus luteum, you can see down here, is to secrete progesterone and estrogen. This is another example of positive feedback. So after ovulation has occurred, your progesterone massively increases and your estrogen increases as well. And the reason that happens is because the estrogen and progesterone help to increase the thickness of the uterine lining. We want the uterus lining to increase in thickness because the thicker it is, the more likely it is that your fertilized egg, will be able to embed itself in the uterus lining. So a nice thick uterus lining means that a fertilized egg can embed itself within the lining and a pregnancy can occur. The progesterone and estrogen at this stage also help to inhibit FSH and LH, because if a pregnancy is going to occur, then we don't need another egg to be released and we don't need ovulation to occur. So the progesterone and estrogen at this stage help to inhibit FSH and LH. Now, what we can see at 28 days, this is the end of the cycle, is we see the whole thing starting again. And what happens is the progesterone decreases towards the end of the cycle, and this signals that a pregnancy did not occur, fertilization didn't occur, no pregnancy occurred, so therefore menstruation can occur again. We can shed the lining of the uterus. Obviously, if pregnancy has occurred, we don't want to shed the lining of the uterus, because we're going to lose that blastocyst that has hopefully implanted itself within the wall of the uterus. So that's the menstrual cycle. No easy way to remember it apart from just learn it. I think that the graphs really help help you to visualize it. So you might want to find a kind of a graphic that you really understand and perhaps annotate it, or write it out or color code it, anything like that that's going to help you remember. Last bit. So we need to know about IVF. IVF is in vitro fertilization. So in vitro refers to anything that happens in the lab. In vivo refers to things that happen within the body. So generally, fertilization would be in vivo because it happens in the body. If people are struggling to conceive, there are a variety of reasons why you might struggle to conceive, then they might choose to undergo IVF, or in vitro fertilization. Before the IVF starts, the female has to take drugs to inhibit all of the reproductive hormones involved in the menstrual cycle. And that means that doctors have control over the cycle, and they can kind of decide when everything occurs, because things have to occur in a certain sequence in order for the IVF to be successful. So the female would then be given about 10 days of FSH and LH injections. And what this does is it stimulates something called superovulation. So it means that many of those follicles develop rather than just the one that would usually develop every month. So lots and lots of them develop. The eggs are then taken from the uterus by the doctors, and they are fertilized in the lab using the father's sperm. So we take the eggs from the uterus, which is obviously an invasive procedure, take the eggs out, fertilize them by the sperm, and then we let the fertilized eggs grow and divide for a few days. And that is called actually a blastocyst as opposed to an embryo, but you might not have heard the word blastocyst. So that blastocyst can then be transferred back into the uterus 2 to 5 days later. So the female would need to go back to the doctor for the implantation, for the transplant. Transplant? That's probably the wrong word. To put it back in. So it goes back into the uterus, and it should implant itself into the lining of the uterus. Sometimes some females might need some help with the progesterone in order to maintain the lining, because if the lining of the uterus isn't thick enough, then implantation won't occur. So they may also be given progesterone in order to ensure that implantation does occur. The IVF process is actually quite interesting. It's a really good example of how fertility treatment has kind of come on in quite a short period of time, actually, since they've first developed the technique. This is just a little kind of graphic to show you the process of what occurs during IVF. There's a few bits missing compared to here. It might be useful as well to know that 14 days after the embryo transfer, you can do a pregnancy test to see whether it has worked or not, and whether the female has become pregnant. I think that it's only successful 20% of the time if you do IVF. I think. Don't hold me to that. Okay, last bit, you just need to know a bit about William Harvey and sexual reproduction. So William Harvey spent loads of time, I think it was in like the 1800s, studying the reproductive organs of female deer. And prior to his theory, everybody believed that Aristotle's theory, that was the male produces a seed which forms into an egg when it's mixed with the menstrual blood of the female. So that's how they thought that reproduction occurred. However, Harvey was the first scientist to actually suggest that no, that's not how it happens. However, he didn't actually manage to form a theory that was actually correct. But he realized that Aristotle's theory was wrong. He didn't really understand how fertilization and reproduction actually happened, but he did know that Aristotle was wrong. So his work was interesting because he kind of argued against the accepted theory in his work. And that's all.